The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gates as Margaret Ashford stepped out of her luxury sedan. Her designer heels clicked against the cobblestone pathway with an authority that matched her elevated chin. She was the wife of a prominent businessman, known throughout the city for her extravagant lifestyle and sharp tongue. Today she had been invited to a charity gala being hosted at the royal palace, an event that would place her among the elite of society. Margaret had spent 3 hours that morning perfecting her appearance. Her pearl necklace alone cost more than most people earned in a year, and she made sure everyone knew it. As she approached the palace entrance, she noticed the long line of guests waiting to pass through security. Common people, she thought to herself, having to wait like ordinary citizens. She had no intention of standing in any queue. The royal palace was a magnificent structure that had stood for 3 centuries. Its walls held stories of kings and queens, of diplomatic victories and historical moments that shaped the nation. At every entrance stood the royal sentinels, guards who had trained for years to earn their position. These weren't ordinary security personnel. They were hand-picked soldiers, each one having demonstrated exceptional discipline, loyalty, and dedication to the crown. Their uniforms were pristine, their posture perfect, and their duty sacred. Standing at the main gate was Sentinel James Morrison, a young man of 28 who had served the Royal Guard for 6 years. He came from a humble background, the son of a schoolteacher and a nurse. His parents had instilled in him values of respect, hard work, and integrity. When he joined the Royal Guard, he took an oath to protect the palace and treat every visitor with dignity while maintaining the highest security standards. His record was spotless, and his superiors often praised his calm demeanor, even in difficult situations. Margaret bypassed the regular entrance and marched straight toward the diplomatic entrance, reserved only for foreign dignitaries and members of the royal family. Sentinel Morrison stepped forward politely, his hand raised in a gentle stopping gesture. His voice was respectful but firm as he explained that she would need to use the main entrance like other guests. All visitors, regardless of their status, had to go through proper security protocols. Her face flushed red with anger. How dare this guard speak to her in such a manner? Did he not know who she was? Her husband had donated thousands to various royal charities. She had attended exclusive events that this common soldier could only dream of. Margaret's voice rose sharply as she demanded to be let through immediately. Other guests in the nearby line turned to watch the commotion, some pulling out their phones. Sentinel Morrison remained calm. He explained again, his tone still courteous, that security procedures applied to everyone without exception. It was not a matter of personal choice but royal protocol established for the safety of all guests and the royal family. He offered to escort her to the proper entrance where she would be processed quickly and efficiently. This response only fueled Margaret's rage. She took a step closer to the sentinel, her finger pointing at his chest. She began listing her connections, her wealth, and her social standing. She threatened to have him fired, to speak with his superiors, to make sure he never worked in this city again. The crowd grew larger as her voice became shriller. Some guests whispered to each other, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. Throughout this verbal assault, Sentinel Morrison stood perfectly still. His training had prepared him for difficult situations, though nothing quite like this. He understood that his role required patience and professionalism, especially when dealing with upset guests. He repeated once more that he was simply following orders, and that she was welcome to speak with the security coordinator at the main entrance. Margaret's anger reached its peak. In a moment of pure entitlement and rage, she raised her hand and struck the sentinel across his face. The sharp sound of the slap echoed across the courtyard. Several people gasped. The sentinel's head turned, slightly from the impact, but he remained standing at attention. A red mark began to form on his cheek, visible even from a distance. For a brief moment, everything seemed frozen. The other guests stood in shocked silence. Margaret herself seemed momentarily surprised by her own action, but her pride wouldn't allow her to show any regret. Instead, she doubled down, declaring loudly that this is what happens to people who don't know their place. She expected the sentinel to back down now, perhaps even apologize for causing her such frustration. But something unexpected happened. Sentinel Morrison didn't move. He didn't retaliate, didn't raise his voice, didn't even change his expression. He simply stood there, his eyes forward, his posture unchanged. Then, with the same calm voice he had used throughout the encounter, he spoke into his radio. He reported the assault to his commanding officer, stating the facts clearly and without emotion. Within seconds, 3 more Royal Guards appeared at the gate. Behind them came a senior officer, Captain Elizabeth Hartwell, a woman in her 40s who had dedicated her life to the Royal Guard. She had witnessed the entire incident from the security office through the surveillance cameras. Her expression was stern as she approached, and for the first time, Margaret felt a flutter of uncertainty in her chest. The captain asked Sentinel,
"Morrison, if he was all right, and he confirmed that he was."
She then turned to Margaret, and her words were measured but carried unmistakable weight. She explained that assaulting a royal sentinel was not just an attack on an individual, but an offense against the crown itself. The Royal Guards were extensions of the monarchy, and any physical assault on them while they performed their duty was a serious legal matter. Margaret tried to laugh it off, suggesting that everyone was overreacting. She attempted to use her social connections as a shield, mentioning names of people she knew, events she had attended, and contributions she had made. But Captain Hartwell remained unmoved. She informed Margaret that the incident had been recorded on multiple cameras and witnessed by dozens of people. The evidence was clear and undeniable. 2 guards stepped forward and politely but firmly asked Margaret to accompany them to the security office. She would not be attending the gala. Instead, she would be detained until the proper authorities arrived to handle the situation. Margaret's face went pale as the reality of her actions began to sink in. She looked around at the crowd, seeing phones still recording, seeing the judgment in people's eyes. She had expected silence, compliance, perhaps even an apology from the guard. Instead, she had set in motion consequences she never imagined possible. Margaret sat in the security office, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her lap. The room was plain and functional, with bare walls and simple furniture that seemed to mock her expensive outfit. 2 guards stood by the door while Captain Hartwell sat across from her, filling out paperwork with methodical precision. The captain's silence was more unnerving than any lecture could have been. Outside, the charity gala continued without Margaret. Guests who had witnessed the incident at the gate shared the story with others, and soon whispers filled the grand ballroom. Some people checked their social media feeds and found that videos of the altercation were already circulating online. The footage showed everything clearly: Margaret's aggressive approach, her verbal tirade, and most damning of all, the moment her hand struck the sentinel's face. Within an hour, the videos had been shared thousands of times. Margaret's husband, Richard Ashford, was attending a business meeting in another part of the city when his phone began buzzing incessantly. At first he ignored it, but the calls kept coming. When he finally checked his messages, his face went white. Colleagues were sending him links to videos of his wife assaulting a royal guard. The comments below the videos were harsh and unforgiving. People called her entitled, arrogant, and shameful. Some demanded she face legal consequences, while others criticized the privilege that made someone think they could behave that way. Richard excused himself from the meeting and rushed to the palace. His mind raced with worry, not just for his wife, but for his business reputation. He had worked hard to build connections in this city, and now his wife's actions threatened everything. When he arrived at the palace, he was directed to the security office where Margaret sat looking smaller than he had ever seen her. Captain Hartwell explained the situation to Richard with professional courtesy. She showed him the video evidence and explained that the local police had been notified. Assaulting a royal sentinel was classified as assaulting an officer of the crown, which carried serious legal penalties. The royal family took such matters very seriously because the guards represented their authority and safety. If such behavior went unpunished, it would set a dangerous precedent. Richard tried to apologize on behalf of his wife, offering to make donations or compensate the sentinel in any way possible. But Captain Hartwell shook her head. This wasn't a matter that could be resolved with money. Sentinel Morrison had pressed charges, as was his right, and the legal process would have to proceed. She added that the sentinel had shown remarkable restraint and professionalism throughout the incident, which the video footage clearly demonstrated. When the police arrived, they were respectful but firm. Margaret was read her rights and informed that she would be charged with assault of a royal officer. She would need to appear in court to answer for her actions. As she was led out of the palace, photographers and news reporters had already gathered at the gates. Someone had tipped them off about the incident, and they were eager to capture images of the woman who had dared to strike a royal sentinel. The photographs taken that day showed a very different Margaret from the one who had arrived that morning. Her makeup was smudged, her carefully styled hair disheveled, and her expression one of humiliation and shock. These images would appear in newspapers and on news websites, becoming the defining pictures of the scandal. The headlines were brutal, entitled "Socialite Assaults Royal Guard," "Privilege Meets Consequence at Palace Gates," and "When Arrogance Goes Too Far." Sentinel Morrison returned to his post after giving his statement to the authorities. His fellow guards showed him support, but he remained humble about the entire situation. He hadn't sought attention or revenge. He had simply followed protocol and exercised his legal rights when assaulted while performing his duty. His superior officers praised his composure under pressure, noting that many guards would have struggled to maintain such professionalism in the face of physical assault. That evening, the story dominated local news broadcasts. Legal experts were brought in to discuss the case, and they all agreed that Margaret faced serious consequences. One lawyer explained that royal sentinels held a special legal status, similar to police officers or military personnel on duty. Assaulting them carried penalties that could include substantial fines and even imprisonment, depending on the severity of the case and the defendant's attitude. Social media exploded with reactions. The majority of comments supported Sentinel Morrison and condemned Margaret's behavior. People shared their own stories of encountering entitled individuals who believed rules didn't apply to them. Some users researched Margaret's background and found previous instances where she had treated service workers and employees poorly, though nothing as dramatic as this incident. A few voices tried to defend Margaret, suggesting that the punishment seemed excessive for a single slap. But these comments were quickly overwhelmed by responses pointing out that assault was assault. Regardless of the victim's profession, many people noted that if an ordinary citizen had struck a police officer, they would face similar or worse consequences. Why should someone wealthy be treated differently? Richard Ashford spent the evening making phone calls to lawyers and public relations consultants. He needed to protect his business interests while dealing with his wife's legal troubles. Some of his business partners called to distance themselves from the scandal, worried about their own reputations. Contracts that had seemed secure suddenly became uncertain. Richard realized that his wife's brief moment of anger might cost them more than just legal fees. Margaret sat in their home that night, scrolling through her phone and seeing her face everywhere. Friends she had considered close were noticeably silent. Her social media accounts, once filled with admiring comments about her lifestyle, now overflowed with criticism. Some people she had known for years posted statements condemning her actions. The charity organization that had invited her to the gala released a statement expressing disappointment and emphasizing that such behavior contradicted their values. The next morning brought no relief. Major newspapers ran the story on their front pages. Television morning shows discussed the incident, with hosts expressing shock at Margaret's behavior. Child psychologists appeared on programs to discuss what the incident taught about entitlement and respect. Teachers reported using the story in classrooms to discuss consequences and treating others with dignity. Margaret's lawyer, a skilled attorney named David Chen, visited her at home to discuss the case. He was frank in his assessment. The evidence against her was overwhelming and undeniable. Multiple camera angles had captured the assault, and dozens of witnesses had seen it happen. The video showing her striking the sentinel had been viewed millions of times online. Fighting the charges would be nearly impossible and would only extend the media attention. David explained her options. She could plead guilty and hope for leniency by showing genuine remorse, or she could fight the charges and likely face a harsher punishment if found guilty. He strongly recommended the first option. Additionally, he suggested she make a public apology, not just to Sentinel Morrison but to everyone who had been affected by her behavior. It wouldn't erase what she had done, but it might help reduce the court's sentence. Margaret resisted at first. Her pride made it difficult to admit she had been wrong. She tried to justify her actions, claiming she had been stressed and that the Sentinel had been unnecessarily rigid, but David cut through her excuses with cold facts. She had assaulted someone who was simply doing their job. No amount of stress or frustration justified that action. The court would see through any excuse she offered. 3 days after the incident, Margaret's lawyer arranged a press conference. The public relations team had coached her extensively on what to say and how to present herself. They emphasized that she needed to appear genuinely remorseful, not defensive or entitled. Her outfit was carefully selected to appear modest and understated, a stark contrast to the designer ensemble she had worn to the palace. The conference room was packed with journalists, cameras, and curious onlookers. Margaret sat at a table with her lawyer beside her, facing a sea of expectant faces. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the prepared statement. When she began to speak, her voice was quiet and strained, very different from the loud, demanding tone captured in the viral videos. She apologized to Sentinel Morrison directly, acknowledging that he had been performing his duty professionally and that her reaction had been completely inappropriate. She expressed regret for assaulting him and recognized that her behavior had been inexcusable regardless of her frustration. She apologized to the royal family, the Royal Guard institution, and everyone who had witnessed or been affected by her actions. She admitted that her sense of entitlement had clouded her judgment and that she was ashamed of what she had done. The journalists asked sharp questions. One reporter wanted to know if she was only apologizing because of the legal consequences. Another asked if she had treated service workers poorly in the past, referencing stories that had emerged online. Margaret struggled to answer these questions, her carefully rehearsed responses faltering under the pressure. Her lawyer intervened several times to keep the conference on track, but the damage was done. Many viewers felt her apology seemed scripted and insincere. Meanwhile, Sentinel Morrison continued his regular duties at the palace. He declined multiple interview requests, choosing to maintain his privacy and professionalism. The Royal Guard's public relations officer released a brief statement on his behalf, thanking the public for their support and emphasizing that he simply wanted to move forward and continue serving with honor. This dignified silence only increased public respect for him. The court date arrived 2 weeks after the incident. The courthouse was surrounded by media vans and protesters. Some people held signs supporting the Sentinel and demanding accountability for the wealthy. Others, a much smaller group, held signs suggesting the punishment was excessive. Security was tight as Margaret and her legal team entered the building through a side entrance to avoid the crowds. The courtroom was formal and intimidating. The judge, Honorable Patricia Williams, was known for her fair but firm approach to justice. She had 30 years of experience on the bench and little patience for entitled behavior. As the proceedings began, the prosecution presented their case methodically. They showed the video evidence, which was even more damning when viewed in the quiet, serious atmosphere of a courtroom. The sound of the slap seemed louder, Margaret's verbal abuse more cruel. Sentinel Morrison took the stand as a witness. He recounted the events calmly and factually, never exaggerating or showing emotion. When the defense attorney tried to suggest that he could have been more flexible with the security procedures, he respectfully but firmly explained that his duty was to follow protocol without exception. The rules existed for everyone's safety, and making exceptions based on someone's perceived importance would compromise security and fairness. Character witnesses were called for both sides. The prosecution brought forward other palace staff members who testified about the importance of respecting royal guards and the serious nature of the assault. The defense called friends of Margaret who spoke about her charitable work and stressed that this behavior was out of character. However, during cross-examination, some damaging information emerged. Former employees and service workers testified about previous instances where Margaret had been dismissive, rude, or demanding, painting a picture of someone who regularly treated those she considered beneath her with disrespect. The testimonies revealed a pattern that Margaret couldn't deny. A former housekeeper described being yelled at for minor issues and being paid late multiple times. A waiter from an exclusive restaurant recounted an incident where Margaret had berated him publicly over a meal she found unsatisfactory, reducing him to tears in front of other diners. A personal assistant who had worked for her briefly spoke about unreasonable demands and verbal abuse that had caused severe stress. These revelations shocked many people in the courtroom, including Margaret's husband. Richard had known his wife could be demanding, but he hadn't realized the extent of her mistreatment of others. He sat in the gallery, his face growing increasingly troubled as witness after witness described his wife's behavior. Some of the stories made him ashamed, and he began to wonder if he had enabled her attitude by never challenging it. The judge listened to everything with careful attention. When it was time for the defense to present their case, Margaret's lawyer did his best to highlight her charitable donations and community involvement. He presented letters from organizations she had supported financially, thanking her for her contributions. He argued that one moment of poor judgment shouldn't define her entire character, and that she had already suffered significant consequences through public humiliation and damaged reputation. However, the prosecution countered that Margaret's charitable giving didn't excuse assault or mistreatment of individuals. They pointed out that wealthy people often donated to charity while simultaneously treating everyday workers poorly. True character, they argued, was shown in how someone treated people who couldn't benefit them socially or financially. The viral video had shown Margaret's true character when faced with someone she viewed as inferior. When Margaret was asked if she wanted to address the court, she stood nervously. Her lawyer had advised her to speak from the heart, not from a script. She began by repeating her apology to Sentinel Morrison, who sat in the courtroom watching her with calm, unreadable eyes. She admitted that she had lived with privilege for so long that she had forgotten basic human decency and respect. She acknowledged that the testimonies she had heard about her past behavior were accurate, and that she was ashamed of the person she had become. Her voice broke several times as she spoke, and tears rolled down her cheeks. She said she understood if people didn't believe her remorse was genuine, but she promised she wanted to change. She recognized that money and social status didn't make her better than anyone else, and she vowed to work on herself and make amends to those she had hurt. Whether her emotion was genuine remorse or fear of punishment, it was impossible to know for certain. The judge called for a recess to consider the sentencing. The 2-hour wait felt like an eternity for Margaret and her family. In the hallway, Richard finally spoke to his wife about everything they had heard in court. He expressed his disappointment and anger about how she had treated people. He told her that regardless of what the judge decided, their marriage needed serious work or it wouldn't survive. Margaret, facing the potential loss of her freedom and now her marriage, began to truly understand the magnitude of her actions. When court reconvened, Judge Williams delivered her ruling with measured authority. She acknowledged Margaret's apology and charitable work, but emphasized that assault was a serious crime that required serious consequences. The video evidence showed a clear, unprovoked attack on someone performing their lawful duty. The additional testimonies revealed a pattern of entitled behavior that suggested this incident wasn't an isolated mistake, but rather a symptom of deeper character issues. The judge sentenced Margaret to 6 months in county jail, with the possibility of serving half the time on house arrest if she completed anger management courses and community service. Additionally, she was ordered to pay a substantial fine, write a formal written apology to Sentinel Morrison, and complete 300 hours of community service working directly with service workers and low-income communities after her release. The judge stated that this sentence served both as punishment and as an opportunity for genuine rehabilitation. The courtroom erupted in whispers as the judge's gavel struck the bench, finalizing the sentence. Margaret's face went pale as the reality of spending months behind bars settled over her. Her lawyer placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, while Richard sat motionless in the gallery, processing what this meant for their family and his business. Outside the courthouse, news reporters rushed to broadcast the verdict, and within minutes, the story was trending worldwide. Margaret was given 2 weeks to arrange her affairs before beginning her sentence. Those 14 days were among the hardest of her life. She had to inform her elderly parents about the situation, watching her father's disappointment and her mother's tears. She met with her business manager to handle financial matters and contacted the charities where she served on boards to resign from her positions. Most organizations had already quietly removed her name from their materials, anticipating this outcome. During this time, Margaret also began the anger management courses that the judge had mandated. The sessions were held in a community center in a modest neighborhood, far from the upscale areas she usually frequented. The counselor, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, was a woman in her 50s who had worked with various clients from different backgrounds. She had no interest in Margaret's wealth or social standing, and treated her like any other person struggling with behavioral issues. In their first session, Dr. Mitchell asked Margaret to describe the incident at the palace in detail. As Margaret recounted the story, the counselor stopped her repeatedly to question her thought process. Why had she felt entitled to bypass security? Why had she viewed the Sentinel's instructions as a personal insult? What made her believe that striking another person was an acceptable response to frustration? These questions forced Margaret to confront uncomfortable truths about her attitudes and beliefs. Dr. Mitchell explained that true change required more than just apologizing or facing legal consequences. Margaret needed to examine the deep-rooted sense of superiority that had shaped her behavior for years. This wasn't about one bad day or a momentary lapse in judgment. The testimonies in court had revealed a pattern of viewing service workers and people in certain professions as lesser, individuals whose feelings and dignity didn't matter. The other members of the anger management group came from various backgrounds. There was a construction worker who had gotten into fights at bars, a young mother who had lashed out at teachers when stressed, and a retired military veteran dealing with unresolved trauma. Initially, Margaret felt out of place and superior even here, but the group discussions gradually broke down those walls. She heard their stories of regret and struggle, realizing that anger and poor choices affected people regardless of their bank accounts. Meanwhile, Richard faced his own challenges. Several of his business partners had distanced themselves from him due to the scandal. Some contracts were put on hold or canceled outright. Colleagues who had once sought his company now avoided him at professional gatherings. He realized that his wife's reputation had become entangled with his own, and untangling them would take time and effort. Richard also began attending therapy sessions, separately from Margaret's court-mandated counseling. He needed to understand his own role in enabling his wife's behavior over the years. His therapist helped him recognize that by never challenging Margaret's treatment of others, by excusing her rudeness as stress or personality quirks, he had indirectly supported her sense of entitlement. True partnership, he learned, sometimes meant holding your spouse accountable. The day arrived when Margaret had to report to county jail. She was allowed to serve the first 3 months incarcerated, with the possibility of transitioning to house arrest for the remaining time if she demonstrated good behavior and progress in her rehabilitation. Richard drove her to the facility in silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. At the entrance, they shared a brief embrace before Margaret walked through the doors that would close behind her. County jail was a shocking environment for someone who had lived in luxury. Margaret was processed like any other inmate, stripped of her designer clothes and given a standard uniform. Her cell was small and sparse, with a narrow bed, a small desk, and a toilet. She shared the space with another inmate, a woman named Rosa, who was serving time for repeated driving violations and unpaid fines. Rosa was initially skeptical of Margaret. Having seen the viral video and news coverage, she viewed her as another rich person who thought she could buy her way out of consequences. But living in close quarters made it impossible to maintain false pretenses. Over the first few days, they began talking during the long, monotonous hours. Margaret learned that Rosa worked 2 jobs to support her 3 children, and had gotten into legal trouble because she couldn't afford to pay traffic tickets that had accumulated. Hearing Rosa's story gave Margaret perspective she had never had before. Rosa hadn't struck anyone or acted violently, yet she was facing similar consequences because she lacked the financial resources to handle her situation differently. The unfairness struck Margaret in a way that began to genuinely change her thinking. She started to understand that her privilege had shielded her from consequences for most of her life. And this was perhaps the first time she was truly being held accountable. Life in jail followed a strict routine. Wake-up was early, meals were basic and served at specific times, and activities were limited and supervised. Margaret attended mandatory programs including more anger management sessions, life skills classes, and group therapy. She worked in the jail kitchen and library, performing tasks she had never done before. Washing dishes, mopping floors, and organizing books gave her a new appreciation for the work that others did, work she had previously dismissed as unimportant. In the group therapy sessions, Margaret met women from vastly different circumstances. Some were there for drug-related offenses, others for theft driven by desperation, and some for violent crimes they deeply regretted. Listening to their stories was humbling. Many had faced hardships Margaret couldn't imagine, yet they showed resilience and humanity that challenged her previous assumptions about people based on their social class or circumstances. One woman, Patricia had been a teacher before making a terrible mistake that landed her in jail. She spoke eloquently about how one poor decision had unraveled her entire life, costing her career, respect, and time with her family. Her story resonated with Margaret because, despite their different backgrounds, they shared the experience of watching their lives fall apart due to their own actions. Patricia's grace and determination to rebuild inspired Margaret to approach her situation with similar resolve. Back in the outside world, the public discourse around Margaret's case continued. Some people felt the sentence was too harsh, arguing that wealthy people often received lighter punishments for more serious crimes. Others believed it was appropriate, pointing out that accountability should apply equally to everyone. The case sparked broader conversations about privilege, entitlement, and how society should handle those who abuse their position. Sentinel Morrison returned to his normal life as much as possible. The Royal Guard promoted him to a senior position, recognizing both his exemplary conduct during the incident and his professionalism throughout the legal process. He used some of the media attention to advocate for better treatment of service workers and security personnel, giving a few carefully chosen interviews where he spoke about the importance of respecting people in all professions. In one interview, Morrison said something that particularly resonated with audiences. He explained that respect wasn't about position or wealth, but about recognizing the inherent dignity in every person. When people treated service workers poorly, they revealed their own character flaws, not any lesser worth than those they were mistreating. His words were widely quoted and shared, becoming part of the larger conversation his case had started. Richard visited Margaret weekly during visiting hours. Their conversations were difficult but necessary. He told her about the challenges he faced in business and social circles, but also about the positive changes he was experiencing through therapy. He admitted his own faults in their relationship and expressed hope that they could rebuild on a healthier foundation. Margaret appreciated his honesty and commitment, even as she struggled with guilt about the consequences her actions had brought to their lives. After 3 months of incarceration, Margaret appeared before a review board to determine if she qualified for house arrest. The board consisted of a judge, a social worker, and a corrections officer who evaluated her behavior, participation in programs, and genuine progress toward rehabilitation. They reviewed reports from her counselors, interviewed her cellmate and other inmates, and assessed whether she posed any risk if released to house arrest. The reports were surprisingly positive. Dr. Mitchell, who had continued Margaret's anger management sessions inside the jail, noted significant progress in her ability to recognize triggers and manage emotional responses. The kitchen supervisor reported that Margaret had become a reliable worker, who treated fellow inmates and staff with consistent respect. Even Rosa, her cellmate, testified that Margaret had changed from the entitled woman she had been when she arrived. Rosa shared a specific story that impressed the review board. Another inmate had been bullying a younger woman, taking her commissary items and making her life miserable. Margaret had witnessed this and, despite her own vulnerable position, had spoken up to the guards and offered support to the younger inmate. This intervention had required courage because it risked making Margaret herself a target. The guards confirmed the incident and noted that Margaret's action had helped stop a problematic situation. The board granted Margaret's request for house arrest. She would spend the remaining 3 months confined to her home, wearing an electronic monitoring device and continuing her therapy and community service preparations. She could only leave for approved reasons like medical appointments, therapy sessions, and supervised community service once that began. Violating any condition would send her back to jail to serve the remainder of her sentence. Returning home felt surreal for Margaret. Her house, once a symbol of her success and status, now felt almost too large and impersonal. The luxury that had surrounded her seemed hollow after months of living with the basics. Richard had kept the house maintained but had made some changes. He had donated many of their excessive decorations and unnecessary luxury items to charity, simplifying their living space. This decision aligned with his own journey toward understanding what truly mattered in life. Margaret's days under house arrest followed a structured schedule. She woke early and participated in virtual therapy sessions with Dr. Mitchell. She studied materials about empathy, privilege, and social responsibility that her counselor assigned. She prepared for her upcoming community service by researching the organizations where she would work and learning about the populations they served. The electronic monitor on her ankle was a constant reminder of her circumstances and the consequences of her actions. During this time, Margaret also worked on the written apology that the judge had ordered. She had already given verbal apologies, but this written document needed to be thoughtful, detailed, and genuine. She wrote multiple drafts, each time digging deeper into her understanding of what she had done wrong and why. She wrote about the Sentinel's professionalism, her own failings, and what she had learned. After weeks of revisions and feedback from Dr. Mitchell, she completed a letter that honestly reflected her journey toward accountability. The apology letter was delivered to Sentinel Morrison through official channels. He read it privately and chose not to make any public statement about it. However, through his attorney, he acknowledged receiving the letter and indicated that he appreciated Margaret's efforts toward genuine change. He emphasized that while he accepted her apology, actions would speak louder than words, and he hoped her future behavior would reflect the lessons she claimed to have learned. As Margaret's house arrest period progressed, she began volunteering remotely for organizations that supported workers' rights and provided resources for low-income families. She participated in virtual discussions about privilege and social responsibility, often sharing her own story as a cautionary tale. These activities were part of her preparation for the in-person community service that would follow her house arrest. Richard and Margaret spent significant time together during this period, something they hadn't done in years despite living in the same house. They attended couples counseling sessions via video call, working through years of unhealthy patterns in their relationship. Richard confronted Margaret about specific instances where he had witnessed her mistreating others but had remained silent. Margaret had to face the reality that her behavior had affected not just strangers, but her own marriage and family relationships. These conversations were painful but necessary. Margaret learned that her parents had often been embarrassed by her treatment of their household staff, but had never addressed it directly, hoping she would mature and change on her own. Her sister, with whom she had a distant relationship, admitted that she had avoided family gatherings because of Margaret's constant need to demonstrate superiority and make others feel small. Hearing this from her own family was devastating but enlightening. The end of Margaret's house arrest approached, but her real work was just beginning. The judge had mandated 300 hours of community service, specifically requiring that she work directly with service workers and in low-income communities. The organization coordinating her service, Community Bridge Foundation, had designed a program that would challenge her to step completely outside her comfort zone. Her first assignment was at a homeless shelter, where she would help prepare and serve meals, clean facilities, and assist residents with basic needs. The shelter's director, Marcus Johnson, was a no-nonsense man who had grown up in poverty and worked his way through college to earn a social work degree. He had agreed to supervise Margaret's service, but made it clear that he expected hard work and genuine engagement, not performative charity. On her first day at the shelter, Margaret arrived nervous and uncertain. She wore simple clothes as instructed and tied her hair back practically. Marcus gave her a brief orientation and then immediately put her to work chopping vegetables in the kitchen. The work was physically demanding, and within an hour her hands were sore and her back ached from standing, but she didn't complain. She remembered Rosa and the other women she had met in jail who did this kind of work every day to survive. The kitchen staff consisted of 2 paid cooks and several volunteers, including people who were formerly homeless themselves and now gave back to the shelter that had helped them. Margaret worked alongside them, listening to their stories during breaks. One woman, Teresa, had been a successful accountant before a series of tragedies, including her husband's death and a serious illness, had left her homeless. Her story shattered Margaret's previous assumptions that homelessness only happened to people who had made poor choices or didn't work hard enough. During meal service, Margaret served food to the shelter residents. She looked into their faces, many weathered by hardship but still showing dignity and hope. Some were families with children, their parents working multiple jobs but still unable to afford housing in the expensive city. Others were elderly people whose fixed incomes couldn't keep pace with rising costs. Some struggled with mental illness or addiction, conditions that Margaret now understood were often symptoms of trauma rather than personal failings. One evening, a man in his 60s came through the serving line. He was neatly dressed, despite his circumstances, and thanked Margaret politely for the meal. Marcus later told her that the man, Robert, had been a university professor who lost everything during a financial crisis and subsequent depression. He now spent his days in the library, still reading and learning, waiting for an opportunity to rebuild his life. Robert's story deeply moved Margaret because it showed how quickly anyone's life could change. As weeks passed, Margaret's role at the shelter expanded. She helped organize donated clothing, assisted residents with job applications, and supervised activities for children whose families lived at the shelter temporarily. Working with the children was particularly impactful. These kids laughed, played, and dreamed just like any children, but they carried burdens no child should face. Margaret read to them, helped with homework, and listened to their hopes for the future. One little girl named Emma, who was 7 years old, became especially attached to Margaret. Emma's mother worked 2 jobs, leaving early and returning late, so Emma spent most of her time at the shelter. She loved drawing and would create pictures to give to Margaret at the end of each day. One drawing showed 2 women holding hands, labeled Emma and Miss Margaret. When Margaret asked about it, Emma said she had drawn them because Margaret always smiled at her and made her feel important. That simple drawing broke something open in Margaret's heart. She realized that she had spent years making people feel small and unimportant, and now this child was thanking her for the basic kindness of acknowledging her existence. Margaret kept that drawing and looked at it whenever she felt tired or discouraged. It reminded her why this work mattered and who she wanted to become. Marcus observed Margaret's progress with cautious approval. He had supervised many court-ordered volunteers over the years, and most did the minimum required to complete their hours. But Margaret showed up early, stayed late when needed, and genuinely engaged with the residents. He noted how she had stopped checking. The final weeks of Margaret's community service took her to a restaurant workers' advocacy center, an assignment that carried particular significance given her history of mistreating service staff. The center provided support for restaurant workers facing wage theft, harassment, and unsafe working conditions. Margaret's role involved administrative tasks, organizing resources, and most challengingly, listening to workers share their experiences. Director Maria Santos ran the center with passionate dedication. She had worked as a server for 15 years before becoming an advocate for workers' rights. Maria knew about Margaret's case and had initially been skeptical about having her volunteer there. However, she believed in second chances and was willing to see if Margaret's transformation was genuine. She made it clear that this wasn't about Margaret's redemption, but about serving workers who needed support. During her first week, Margaret attended support group meetings where restaurant workers shared their stories. She heard about servers who survived on tips while restaurants paid below minimum wage. She learned about kitchen staff working in dangerous conditions without proper safety equipment. She listened to stories of sexual harassment, verbal abuse from customers and managers, and the constant stress of unstable schedules that made it impossible to plan childcare or attend school. One server named Daniel shared how a customer had humiliated him in front of the entire restaurant over a minor issue with his order. The customer had demanded Daniel be fired and threatened to ruin the restaurant's reputation online. Daniel had stood there, forced to apologize repeatedly while the customer berated him, knowing that defending himself could cost him his job and the income his family depended on. As he spoke, Margaret felt her stomach turn, recognizing herself in that customer's behavior. After the meeting, Margaret approached Daniel privately. Her hand shook as she told him that she had been that kind of customer, that she had treated servers exactly the way he described, never considering the person behind the uniform. She apologized not just for her specific incident at the palace, but for every time she had made a service worker feel small or worthless. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before nodding slowly, acknowledging her words without absolving her. Maria assigned Margaret to help organize a job fair for restaurant workers seeking better opportunities. Margaret contacted businesses, arranged logistics, and prepared materials. She worked alongside current and former restaurant workers who volunteered their time despite their exhausting schedules. Their dedication humbled her. These were people who had every reason to be bitter about their treatment, but instead chose to help others in similar situations. The job fair was successful, connecting dozens of workers with employers who offered fair wages and respectful work environments. Margaret watched as workers nervously presented themselves to potential employers, hoping for opportunities that would improve their lives. She saw their relief and joy when offered positions, understanding now what those opportunities meant for their families and futures. One afternoon, Maria asked Margaret to help organize the center's files, which included documentation of wage theft cases. Reading through these files was heartbreaking. Margaret learned about workers who had worked overtime without compensation, had tips stolen by managers, or were fired for requesting their legal breaks. The amounts of money stolen often seemed small individually, maybe $50 or $100, but for workers living paycheck to paycheck, that money meant the difference between paying rent or facing eviction. Margaret found herself becoming angry on behalf of these workers, an emotion she channeled into her volunteer work. She helped workers fill out complaint forms, organize documentation for legal cases, and research their rights. She discovered a passion for advocacy she never knew she had, finding purpose in fighting for people who had been treated unjustly. As her 300 hours of community service neared completion, Margaret reflected on how profoundly the experience had changed her. She had entered this journey as punishment for her crime, expecting to endure it and move on with her life. Instead, she had encountered real people whose stories challenged everything she thought she knew about success, worth, and dignity. She had learned that character wasn't measured by wealth or status, but by how you treated others, especially those who couldn't benefit you. On her final day at the Advocacy Center, the workers threw a small gathering to mark the completion of her service. Margaret was surprised and touched by the gesture. Several workers spoke about how her genuine engagement had impacted them. Maria presented her with a certificate of completion, but also with something more meaningful. A handwritten card signed by dozens of workers thanking her for listening to their stories and treating them with respect. Margaret spoke briefly to the group, her voice thick with emotion. She thanked them for allowing her into their community and for teaching her lessons she should have learned long ago. She promised that her work wouldn't end with her court-mandated hours, that she intended to continue advocating for workers' rights and treating every person she encountered with the dignity they deserved. The applause she received was cautious but warm, recognition that while her past couldn't be erased, her future could be different. The local media, which had covered Margaret's case from the beginning, requested an interview now that her sentence was complete. Her lawyer and public relations team advised her on handling the interview, but Margaret insisted on speaking authentically rather than from a script. The interview aired on a local evening news program, reaching thousands of viewers who had followed her story. The interviewer asked direct questions about Margaret's journey from that day at the palace gates to now. Margaret answered honestly, not making excuses for her behavior but explaining how the consequences had forced her to confront ugly truths about herself. She spoke about the people she had met during her community service, sharing their stories with permission and highlighting the systemic issues they faced. She emphasized that her personal redemption wasn't the important story, but rather the ongoing struggles of service workers who deserved better treatment and conditions. When asked if she had forgiven herself, Margaret paused thoughtfully. She explained that forgiveness wasn't really the point. She had done something wrong, hurt someone who was simply doing his job, and revealed a pattern of treating people poorly. The goal wasn't to forgive herself and move on unchanged, but to become a fundamentally different person through genuine transformation. Whether others forgave her wasn't something she could control or demand, only work toward earning through consistent, long-term changed behavior. The interview generated mixed reactions. Some viewers felt she was still privileged, using her story for positive publicity, while others faced harsh punishment, without opportunities for redemption. Others saw genuine change and appreciated her acknowledgement of systemic issues beyond her personal situation. The discussion itself was valuable, keeping important conversations about privilege, accountability, and workers' rights in the public eye. Sentinel Morrison watched the interview from his home. He had followed Margaret's journey from a distance, curious whether her apology and claimed transformation were sincere. Hearing her speak about the workers she had met and the lessons she had learned, he felt cautiously optimistic. He still believed she had deserved the consequences she faced, but he also believed in people's capacity to change. Time would tell if her transformation lasted beyond her legal obligations. Margaret returned to a version of normal life, though it looked very different from before. She continued therapy with Dr. Mitchell, recognizing that changing deep-seated patterns required ongoing work. She maintained her volunteer work at the homeless shelter and advocacy center, now giving her time freely, rather than fulfilling court requirements. She had discovered that this work gave her life meaning that shopping and social status never had. Richard and Margaret's relationship stabilized on a healthier foundation. They had both done significant personal work, examining their values and priorities. They downsized to a smaller home, donating the excess money to organizations supporting workers' rights and homelessness prevention. They established a foundation focused on providing resources for service workers pursuing education and training for better opportunities. Margaret reconnected with her family, including her sister, with whom she worked to rebuild their relationship. She apologized to former employees and household staff she had mistreated, not expecting forgiveness but wanting them to know she recognized her wrongdoing. Some accepted her apology, others didn't respond, and a few expressed appreciation for the acknowledgement even if they couldn't forget the hurt. The viral video of Margaret striking the Sentinel remained online, a permanent record of her worst moment. She had initially wanted it removed, but came to understand it served an important purpose. It stood as evidence of how privilege and entitlement could corrupt someone's character, and as a reminder to herself of who she never wanted to be again. Young people studying ethics and social responsibility watched the video in classrooms, discussing what it revealed about respect, consequences, and change. Margaret accepted speaking invitations at universities and community organizations, sharing her story as